Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we cut through the noise, bypass the textbooks, and get straight to the foundational ideas that shape our modern world.
Today, we are diving deep into a figure whose influence is so pervasive you might not even realize it.
We're talking about John Locke. Born in 1632, died in 1704, he's often called the father of liberalism.
And he is, but to just leave it at that label is to miss the incredible complexity of the man. His ideas are, and this is no exaggeration, the literal blueprint for modern governance.
But the man himself is a study in contradictions, some of them pretty troubling.
Oh, absolutely.
That's right. So our listeners shared a really comprehensive stack of sources on Locke, the physician, the philosopher, the pragmatic political operator, and our mission today is to rapidly dissect that impact.
And we need to understand not just the big famous principles he laid down, like the tabula rasa, the blank slate, and natural rights.
Right. We also have to get into the messy, real-world context of his personal choices and his political actions.
That dual focus is just essential. We have to look at the lofty universal theories.
The ones that end up in the U.S. Declaration of Independence.
Exactly. And we have to put those right alongside the, let's say, contradictory ways he participated in the systems of his time. We're talking about colonial administration, wealth, and, yes, the slave trade.
It's a journey that takes us from a quiet Oxford college to the high-stakes world of London politics and back again. So let's unpack this life story and start with the man in his context.
Let's do it.
So John Locke was born in 1632 in a town called Rington in Somerset. And the environment he grew up in is just crucial, isn't it?
It's everything. His family was deeply Puritan. And this wasn't just a casual affiliation. This was the core of their identity.
Which put them on the side of dissent, of skepticism toward the established church and the crown.
And his father was an attorney, but more importantly, he was a cavalry captain for the parliamentarians during the English Civil War.
Okay, so imagine growing up in that house. The dinner table conversation is about whether a king's power comes from God or if it comes from the people.
Precisely. That conflict plants the seeds of skepticism toward absolute monarchy from day one.
So he gets a very traditional, elite education. He goes to Westminster School and then on to Christ Church, Oxford. But he wasn't exactly thrilled with what they were teaching, was he?
Not at all. This is a really key detail about him. He found the traditional curriculum, which was mostly just rehashing Aristotle, just incredibly dull, stultifying.
So while they're pushing Aristotle on him, he's off reading the moderns.
He's secretly devouring philosophers like René Descartes. He was drawn to this new philosophy that was based on observation and reason, not just on ancient authority.
So that frustration with the old way of thinking pushes him towards something new.
It pushes him towards science and medicine, a decisive shift.
And that's what brings him into contact with the real cutting-edge thinkers of the 17th century.
Exactly. Through friends, he gets exposed to the experimental philosophy being practiced at the Royal Society, which he later joined. And his study of medicine wasn't a hobby. He had a Bachelor of Medicine in 1675.
And he starts working with absolute giants of the era.
People like the chemist Robert Boyle and the polymath Robert Hooke. This period was completely transformative for him.
So this grounding in empirical science and medical observation, that's the engine for his whole philosophy.
It's the engine. It gives him the tools, the methodology, to look at the human mind as a system you can actually study, just like Audi. His medical training gives him the empirical mindset.
And his Puritan background gives him the political skepticism.
And you fuse those two things together, and you get the revolutionary John Locke.
Okay, so now we get to the moment that really catapults him from academia into the absolute highest levels of English politics.
Anthony Ashley Cooper, Lord Ashley, later the first Earl of Shaftesbury.
Tell us about that meeting. It sounds like something out of a movie.
It really does. It's high-stakes medical drama. Shaftesbury, who's already this huge figure in the court of Charles II, comes to Oxford in 1666, and he has a life-threatening liver infection.
And the standard treatments of the day, the bleeding and so on, they're not working.
They're failing. It's an abscess. It's incredibly dangerous. And somehow, Locke, who's still basically just an academic studying medicine, gets called in.
The pressure must have been immense.
Immense. But he handled it with this incredible methodical calm. He didn't just act as the doctor, he coordinated all the advice. And he and the other physicians came to a terrifying conclusion.
Surgery.
Surgery, which at that time was often a death sentence. But Locke oversaw this procedure to insert a silver tube into Shaftesbury's abdomen to drain the abscess.
And it worked. He saves the life of one of the most powerful men in England.
He does, and that act cements this lifelong bond of loyalty and gratitude. Shaftesbury was so impressed with Locke's mind, his skill, his trustworthiness.
He basically tells him to get out of Oxford and come to London.
Pretty much. He says, your ideas are too important for the classroom. Come with me, and I'll show you how the world really works.
And so in 1667, Locke moves into Shaftesbury's London home, Exeter House. And he's transformed from a quiet academic into a high-level political operator.
Instantly. He's plunged right into the heart of what would become the Whig movement, which was all about opposing absolute monarchy and a Catholic succession to the throne.
And he wasn't just sitting on the sidelines. He's given actual jobs.
Very hands-on roles. He was secretary to the Lords Proprietors of Carolina and secretary of the Board of Trade and Plantations.
So he's writing colonial policy, he's dealing with trade, economics,
And, controversially, the administration of colonies that were built on servitude and exploitation. This is where you see the Lockean paradox in its earliest form.
Yeah.
The philosopher of liberty is writing policy for colonial expansion.
Okay, so this background medicine, science, hard politics is the perfect crucible for his major works. Let's talk about the timing of those.
This is one of the biggest changes in how we understand Locke. I'm talking about his most famous political work, the Two Treatises of Government.
Right. For a long time, everyone thought he wrote it after the Glorious Revolution of 1688.
As a justification for what had already happened, making him seem like a defender of the new status quo.
But modern scholarship has completely flipped that idea on its head.
It has. The work of Peter Laslett in the 1960s was groundbreaking. He argued that the bulk of the two treatises was actually written much earlier, around 1679, right in the middle of a major political crisis.
At Shaftesbury's urging, probably.
Almost certainly. So that changes everything, doesn't it? It means the book isn't a justification after the fact.
It's a revolutionary argument against absolute monarchy. It's a call to arms, written when the fight was still happening.
It was treasonous. It was an explosive argument against the divine right of kings, challenging thinkers like Robert Filmer and Thomas Hobbes. It was arguing for a government based on the consent of the people.
And of course, the political situation went south for his side. Shaftesbury's plots failed, he fled, and Locke was implicated.
He had to flee too. He went to the Netherlands in 1683, under suspicion for being part of the Rye House plot to assassinate the king. He lived there for 5 years, under a fake name, Dr. Van Linden.
But that exile, as difficult as it must have been, was incredibly productive for him.
He gave him the space he needed. He's in Holland, associating with these free-thinking, dissenting Protestant groups, some with connections to Spinoza's circle.
Which would have reinforced all his ideas about tolerance.
Absolutely, and it's during this period that he composes his letter concerning toleration and does the bulk of the work on his masterpiece of epistemology, an essay concerning human understanding.
And then the big return. 1689, the Glorious Revolution is a success, and he comes back to England with the new queen, Mary II.
And then comes the publishing spree. In just a couple of years, the essay, the two treatises, and the letter concerning toleration all come out. It's this incredible burst of intellectual output that cements him as the hero of the new Whig government.
He lived out his final years as a kind of elder statesman, didn't he?
He did, at the country home of his friend Lady Masham, corresponding with people like Isaac Newton, a pillar of the new establishment he had helped, in secret, to create.
A perfect transition. Let's move from the life to the radical ideas themselves, starting with his theory of the mind.
Let's do it.
So when Locke turns that empirical medical mind of his to the question of how do we know what we know, he starts a revolution. And it all begins with one core idea.
The tabula rasa.
The blank slate.
Exactly. It's a Latin phrase for a scraped tablet one you could write on. Locke's whole system is agreed on this one postulate. At birth, the mind is empty.
So no pre-existing concepts, no innate idea of God or good and evil.
Nothing. It's a direct contradiction of the philosophers who came before him, especially Descartes, who believed we were born with certain innate ideas already in place.
Okay, so if the mind is empty at birth, everything we know has to be built from scratch. Where does the information come from?
For Locke, it comes from one place and one place only: experience. This is the absolute foundation of empiricism. All our ideas, which are the building blocks of knowledge, come from what he called two distinct fountains.
Let's break those down. What's the first one?
The first is sensation. This is the most obvious one. It's just the perception of the outside world through our senses.
Looking at a blue sky, feeling heat from a fire, tasting salt.
All simple ideas derive directly from sensation.
And the second fountain is more internal, right?
Yes. The second is reflection. This is our perception of our own mind's operations, the act of thinking, doubting, believing, willing. It's the internal sense. So sensation gives us ideas about the external world,
And reflection gives us ideas about our own internal world, our consciousness.
which every person, as he puts it, has wholly within himself.
So you sense the apple, that's sensation. And then you think about the apple, you remember other apples, you decide you want the apple. It's reflection.
Precisely. And all complex knowledge, ideas like justice or government or art, are just built up by combining these simple ideas from sensation and reflection.
It's so methodical. It's like he's describing a machine for creating knowledge.
And that's exactly what it was. It was a mechanism.
Yeah.
And it completely reoriented philosophy towards subjective experience. It's not about some external truth anymore. It's about how you build truth from your own perceptions.
And this work on how the mind processes information leads him directly to defining what it means to be a person, what it means to be a self.
Yes, and this is maybe his most profound contribution, even if it's less famous than his politics. He completely detaches personal identity from any specific substance, like a soul or even a body.
So what is it then? What makes you you?
It's consciousness. Simple as that.
How does he phrase it?
He defines the self as, and I'm quoting here, that conscious thinking thing, which is sensible or conscious of pleasure and pain, capable of happiness or misery, and so is concerned for itself, as far as that consciousness extends.
So my identity is just the continuous stream of my memories and my self-awareness.
That's it. It's a radical break. Your identity isn't guaranteed by God or by your physical form. It's psychological. It's dynamic.
And intellectual historians argue this is basically the birth of the modern Western self.
It is. This is the self that is defined by its inner life, its personal history. And it's this conscious, remembering self that is capable of consenting to be governed, which connects his psychology directly to his politics.
And his theory about how ideas get linked together in the mind, this association of ideas, that had a huge influence on psychology, didn't it?
It's the basis for what became known as associationism. He was fascinated and a bit worried by how the mind gets wired, especially in childhood.
He noticed that if two ideas get presented together over and over, the mind links them, even if there's no logical connection between them.
Exactly. And that connection can become so strong that you can't have one without the other popping into your head. This is the mechanism for learning, but it's also the mechanism for prejudice and irrational fear.
Which brings us to that very famous example he used, the one about the goblins and sprites.
Right. He warns parents and educators to be so careful about what impressions are made on the tender infancies of children, because those early associations are incredibly powerful and lasting.
And his example is a pretty common domestic scene.
He says, imagine a foolish maid who wants to keep a child from wandering off in the dark. So she tells him stories about goblins and sprites that live in the dark.
So the child's natural unease with darkness gets powerfully, irrationally associated with the terrifying idea of a ghost.
And even when that child grows up and his reason tells him that sprites aren't real, the association is still there. The feeling of terror is permanently linked to darkness in his mind.
So the grown man, as Locke puts it, can no more bear the one than the other.
It's a powerful illustration of his point. The blank slate is incredibly vulnerable to its environment. If you control the input, you control the output. You control the person.
And he formalizes this in his book, Some Thoughts Concerning Education. He says that 9 parts of 10 are what they are, good or evil, useful or not, by their education.
And this is where the idealist philosopher runs headlong into the hard-nosed economic pragmatist.
This is where we get the really controversial stuff, the child labor advocacy.
His essay on the Poor Law from 1697, it's a policy paper about how to deal with poverty in England. And Locke was obsessed with productivity and utility.
His main concern wasn't welfare. It was waste.
Total economic waste.
Mm-hmm.
He looked at the children of the poor, and he lamented that they were being kept in idleness until they were 12 or 14. All that potential labor, as he saw it, was being lost to the public.
So what was his solution?
It was severe. He proposed setting up working schools in every parish for poor children. The goal was to instill a work ethic and make them profitable.
And he proposed they start. When?
He specifically suggests they start from infancy. He names the age of 3.
3 years old. Working.
Yes. They would be brought to the school, taught simple tasks, and their labor would, in theory, pay for their upkeep and even generate a profit for the parish.
That is just a brutal focus on economic utility.
It is. And it's a stark, unavoidable contradiction to his grand principles of natural liberty. It shows how even in his own mind, the demands of a new capitalist economy could collide with the ideals of human dignity.
A perfect bridge, then. Let's move from shaping the individual mind to shaping the political state.
Let's do it.
So Locke's political philosophy, like his rival Thomas Hobbes, starts from this idea of a state of nature, but they go in completely different directions.
They share the starting point of a social contract, that government is an invention and agreement. But their ideas about what came before, about human nature itself, are poles apart.
Everyone knows Hobbes. He saw the state of nature as chaos, a war of all against all. Life was nasty, brutish, and short.
Right. Whereas Locke believed that human nature is fundamentally characterized by reason and tolerance. In the state of nature, people are governed by natural law, which they can discover through reason and which teaches them not to harm one another.
Okay, so if the state of nature is generally peaceful and reasonable, why leave it? Why do we need government at all?
Locke says it's not that it's terrible, it's that it's inconvenient. The main problem is that in the state of nature, every person is their own judge, jury, and executioner when a dispute arises.
And that leads to bias and endless cycles of revenge.
Exactly. But he also identifies a specific thing that makes the state of nature much more unstable.
And that's the invention of money.
That's the invention of money. Because currency allows for unlimited accumulation, it introduces significant inequality and selfishness, which generates much more conflict.
So people agree to form a civil society, a government, not to escape terror, but to get an impartial referee.
Precisely. Government isn't there to create our rights. It's there to protect the rights we already have by nature and to resolve our conflicts in a civil way.
And this brings us to arguably his most famous and influential idea, the definition of those natural rights.
He defines them as inherent, pre-political. They exist before any government. Every person has a natural right to defend their audience. And this phrase is crucial. Life, health, liberty, or possessions.
Life, liberty, and possessions, or property.
That's the bedrock. And any government that fails to protect those rights forfeits its legitimacy.
That simple list has so much power. It's a direct challenge to the idea that rights come from a king or a state.
It's revolutionary. Against the idea of absolute power, Locke offers this elegant, universal set of rights that no government can legitimately violate.
And this list is, of course, the direct blueprint for the American experiment.
Without question. You can draw a straight line from Locke's life, liberty, and property to Thomas Jefferson's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence.
Jefferson called Locke one of the three greatest men who ever lived.
He did, along with Bacon and Newton. And the influence isn't just thematic. The language is there. The Declaration justifies revolution after a long train of abuses by the king.
And that's a direct quote from Locke.
Verbatim from the second treatise. He uses a long train of abuses, prevarications, and artifices to describe the point at which a ruler has broken the trust of the people.
And his influence on the American founders goes beyond just the Declaration, right? It's in the structure of the government itself.
Oh, absolutely. He advocated for a separation of powers, legislative and executive, as a check against tyranny. He demanded a government that was limited, representative, and based entirely on the consent of the governed.
And then there's the most radical idea of all, the one that gave the American Revolution its philosophical license.
The right to revolution. Locke argued that if a government becomes a tyranny and fundamentally violates the social contract,
Revolution isn't just a right, it's an obligation.
it's a moral duty. The people are not only permitted, but are required to dissolve that government and create a new one. That idea alone made him a hero in the American colonies.
But it's interesting, as we noted, his two treatises didn't have that same explosive impact in England right away.
That's a fascinating historical detail. For years, the book was mostly ignored or just cited by people who wanted to attack it.
So who were the English Whigs reading at the time?
They were much more into Algernon Sidney's discourses concerning government. Sidney also argued for resisting tyranny, but he based his arguments on the ancient historical rights of Englishmen and the English Constitution.
So it was a more conservative, more traditional argument.
Exactly. It felt more English. Locke's argument, based on abstract, universal, God-given natural rights that anyone could figure out through reason, that felt a bit too radical, too abstract for the British establishment. Locke really becomes a superstar decades later, when the Americans needed exactly that kind of universal argument.
Let's dig into the concept that drives so much of this. His theory of property. How does he justify private ownership in the first place?
It all comes down to his labor theory of property. The starting point is that God gave the earth to all of humanity in common.
So everything is shared.
Everything is shared until an individual mixes their labor with a part of it. When you exert your effort, your energy on something in nature, you remove it from the common state and make it your own.
So if I pick an apple from a wild tree, my labor of picking it makes it my apple.
That's the basic idea. But, and this is crucial, his original theory had two major limits on it.
Okay, what were they?
First was the anti-waste principle. You could only take as much as you could use before it spoiled. If you gather 100 apples and 90 of them rot, you've taken more than your share and violated natural law.
That makes sense. And the second one is the really famous one.
The Lockean proviso.
Yeah.
It says you can take property for yourself, at least where there is enough, and as good, left in common for others.
So you can't just take the only water source in the desert for yourself.
Exactly. You have a social obligation not to harm others through your appropriation of property. These two rules, together, make his initial theory sound very limited, almost egalitarian.
So how do we get from that to the world of unlimited accumulation and massive inequality that we have today?
The answer is one brilliant and world-changing intellectual maneuver: the introduction of money.
How does money change the rules?
Locke argues that money is made of durable goods, like gold and silver. And the key thing about gold and silver is that they do not spoil or decay.
So they don't violate the anti-waste principle?
They don't. I can't hoard thousands of apples because they will rot, but I can trade all those perishable apples for a few durable gold coins, and I can hoard those coins forever without any of them spoiling.
And just like that, the natural limit on accumulation is gone.
It's completely gone. And Locke knew this. He acknowledged that this would lead to massive inequality, but he argued that this inequality didn't come from the social contract or the government.
Where did it come from then?
He said it came from the tacit agreement of humanity to put a value on money. By agreeing to use money, we all implicitly consented to a system of unlimited accumulation and the inequality that comes with it.
That's a huge claim. So did he offer any solution to the conflict this would obviously create between the rich and the poor?
This is where his theory kind of runs out of steam. He recognizes the problem, and he says it's the government's job to moderate the conflict that arises. But he never really tells us how. He doesn't lay out the principles for taxation or regulation. He basically gives us the philosophical engine for capitalism, but leaves it without any breaks.
And that tension is the perfect place to start looking at the deeper contradictions in his life and work.
The deepest of which is slavery.
Let's go there. The paradox of Locke and slavery is impossible to ignore.
It is the great stain on his legacy. Here you have the man who declared liberty to be an inalienable natural right, and he was an investor in the Royal Africa Company.
The company that ran the British transatlantic slave trade.
He was a stockholder. He profited from the buying and selling of human beings.
And his involvement was more than just financial, wasn't it? As secretary to Shaftesbury, he was involved with the founding of the Carolina colony.
He was. He helped graft the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, and that document contained a chilling clause. It granted the planters absolute power and authority over their Negro slaves.
So he's literally helping to write the legal code for chattel slavery in America while he's formulating his theories of liberty.
Which is why many historians like James Farr just call him a hypocrite. They argue his work helped lay the legal and philosophical groundwork for a system of brutal exploitation.
But the sources also show there's a debate here. Some historians try to add more nuance to his role.
There is a revisionist take. The historian Holly Brewer, for instance, argues that his role in the Carolina Constitution was more like a paid clerk, that he was just revising and copying a document whose core principles were already set.
She also points out that he sold his stock in the Royal Africa Company after just a few years.
Right. And Brewer argues that later in his life, after the Glorious Revolution, he actually worked to undermine slavery. He attacked policies that gave huge land grants to slave owners in Virginia, and he encouraged the Christian baptism of enslaved children.
Which was significant because the justification for slavery often rested on the idea that they were heathens. So baptism was a way to challenge their legal status as property.
It was a subtle but potentially powerful challenge to the whole system.
And then there's the contradiction within his own masterpiece, the Two Treatises. He does provide a justification for slavery, but it's an incredibly narrow one.
It's so narrow that it basically invalidates all the slavery that was actually happening. He says slavery is only legitimate for captives taken in a just war. They forfeited their lives, and their conqueror can enslave them instead of killing them.
But that definition would specifically rule out kidnapping people from another continent. It would rule out hereditary slavery. It would rule out enslaving children.
It rules out the entire basis of the Atlantic slave trade.
Yeah.
So by his own philosophical standard, All the slavery happening in the British Empire was illegitimate.
Which meant, logically, that the enslaved had a moral right, even an obligation to escape.
Exactly. So what do you do with that? Was he a hypocrite whose philosophy accidentally condemned his own investments? Or was it a very clever way of creating a philosophical loophole that sounded good but changed nothing in practice? It's an unavoidable tension.
Let's shift to his views on women in the family. It's another area where he's both progressive for his time and deeply conventional.
He definitely took a hammer to the old patriarchal structure. He directly attacked Robert Filmer's idea that the father had absolute God-given power over his family
How did he do that?
by making a simple but profound change in language. He insisted on talking about parental power, not just paternal power. He explicitly wrote that a mother have an equal title to her children.
Which is a huge elevation of the mother's status in the family.
It is. He saw marriage as a contract. He argued that women had the right to negotiate terms, to have custody of their children, even to divorce. Within the domestic sphere, he was quite progressive.
But that domestic equality didn't translate into the political world.
Not at all. When it comes time to form a government, he's very clear. He writes that it is men who unite into commonwealths.
So women are left out of the original social contract.
That's the argument from critics like Carol Pateman. They say women aren't partners in the contract, they're subjects of it. Their sphere is the home, and they're excluded from the political liberty that men enjoy.
And yet that very exclusion created an opening for later feminist thinkers.
An opening that Mary Wollstonecraft walked right through. She brilliantly used Locke's own ideas, the blank slate, against the patriarchal system.
How so?
Well, if Locke is right that our rationality depends entirely on our education and experience,
Then Wollstonecraft could argue that society keeps women subordinate by deliberately denying them a proper education.
precisely. She argued that society trains women to be alluring mistresses rather than rational wives, deliberately stunting their rational development to keep them dependent. She used Lockean principles to demand equality. It's a fantastic intellectual move.
Just before we move on, let's touch on a less discussed topic. His views on animals. Again, he's pushing back against Descartes.
He is. He completely rejected the Cartesian idea that animals are just unthinking machines, biological robots with no feelings.
So he thought they could think and feel.
He did. He wrote that animals have perception and memory in some degree. He even says oysters and cockles have some kind of dull sensation. He believed they felt pleasure and pain.
So where did he draw the line between humans and animals?
For him, the defining line was the ability to form abstract ideas. An animal can recognize this specific man or this specific apple.
But it can't conceive of the general idea of mankind or appleness.
That's the line. The ability to use language and reason about universal concepts. That, for Locke, was the unique and defining feature of human consciousness.
Let's move on to Locke's ideas about faith and economics, which are deeply intertwined. His arguments for religious tolerance were born from a very bloody history.
Absolutely. He's writing in the aftermath of Europe's devastating wars of religion. So his arguments in the letters concerning toleration aren't just an abstract philosophical exercise. They're a desperate, practical plea for peace.
And he builds his case on three main pillars, all aimed at convincing the government to stay out of the business of saving souls.
Right. The first argument is about humility. He says, earthly judges, the state, simply cannot know for sure which religion is the one true religion. Only God knows that.
So the government has no authority to enforce a specific doctrine.
Exactly. The second argument is psychological. He says you cannot compel belief with violence. True faith requires a genuine inner conviction.
All you can do with force is create hypocrites.
You can make people say the right words, but you can't make them believe. Coercion is ineffective for salvation.
And the third argument is purely pragmatic.
It's the most powerful one, politically. He argues that trying to force everyone into one church leads to more social disorder, more rebellion, and more chaos than just allowing people to worship as they see fit. Diversity is more stable than forced uniformity.
But his tolerance had its limits, didn't it? He made a couple of pretty big exceptions.
He did. He argued that the state should not tolerate atheists.
Why not?
Because for Locke, the entire social order rested on a belief in God. God was the ultimate source of natural law. If you don't believe in God, you don't believe in the basis for morality, for contracts, for oaths.
So an atheist, in his view, couldn't be trusted to be a part of civil society.
He believed it would lead to chaos. It reveals how deeply his entire liberal philosophy is grounded in his Protestant Christian worldview. Natural law and biblical revelation were For him, basically the same thing.
And his deep religious engagement went into some surprising places. His private papers show he was really interested in end times prophecies.
Yes, he was deep into the millenarian debates of his time, just like his friend Isaac Newton. He was fascinated by prophecies about the restoration of the Jews to the land of Israel.
What did he believe would happen?
In his private notes on the Bible, he interpreted a passage from St. Paul as a prophecy that the Jewish people would one day convert to Christianity and be restored to their ancestral homeland. It shows a side of him that's very different from the cool, rational philosopher of politics.
Let's pivot back to the more worldly topic of economics. He had a very modern theory of value and price.
He did. In a work from 1691, he lays out what is basically a supply and demand theory. He said the price of anything is set by its quantity in proportion to their vent.
Vent meaning demand or sales.
Exactly. Quantity is supply, vent is demand. That relationship sets the price.
And he applied this idea to money itself, which led to the quantity theory of money?
Right. He argued that since the demand for money is more or less constant, its value is determined almost exclusively by how much of it is in circulation. If you double the amount of money without creating more goods,
prices will double. Inflation.
A critical insight. He also distinguished the two main functions of money. He said it acts as a counter, which is a way to measure the value of things.
And a pledge.
A pledge, which is a way to claim goods in the future. And this is why he was so insistent on using gold and silver for international trade.
Because unlike paper money, which is only a promise from one government, gold and silver have intrinsic, universal value.
They hold their value as a pledge across all of humanity, which makes international trade and debt possible.
And his overall view of national economies was very much in the mercantilist camp.
Very much so. He believed that the world's supply of money, meaning gold and silver, was constantly growing. Therefore, for a nation to stay powerful, it had to constantly get a bigger piece of that pie.
So you need a favorable balance of trade. Export more than you import.
Always. You had to be constantly enlarging your national stock of gold and silver, or you would fall behind your rivals. It's a very competitive view of the global economy.
Before we wrap up, we should touch on Locke the man, the scholar. He was an obsessive collector and organizer of information.
He really was. His personal library was enormous for the time. He had over 3,000 books when he died.
And it wasn't just English books?
Not at all. Almost 40% of his library came from France and the Netherlands, which shows how connected he was to continental European thought, especially after his exile.
And the subjects tell a story, don't they?
They really do. The biggest category was theology, which was nearly a quarter of his library. That really underscores the religious foundation of everything he thought. Then came medicine, then politics and law. It's the perfect map of his mind.
And we're lucky so much of it survived.
We are. Most of it ended up at the Bodleian Library at Oxford. So scholars can literally trace the development of his ideas through his books and manuscripts.
And he wasn't just a reader. He was known as a master note-taker.
He believed that managing information was a philosophical task in itself. He said a good notebook should be like a chest of drawers for your ideas so nothing gets confused.
And he had his own unique indexing system to make it work.
It's brilliantly nerdy. He used a grid and a system of keywords based on the first letter and first vowel of a word. So a note on an epistle would be filed under I. A note on obedience would be filed under O.
A 17th century life hack.
And he thought it was so useful that he had it published after he died so other people could use it. It just speaks to his methodical, empirical approach to absolutely everything.
So as we pull it all together, what's the lasting legacy? He seems to be the architect of modernity in a few key ways. First, our concept of the self.
Absolutely. He redefined what it means to be a person. The idea that your identity is your consciousness, your experience, your memory, that is the foundation of modern psychology. It's how we think about ourselves today.
Second, obviously, in politics and law.
He's the foundational theorist of classical liberalism, limited government, consent of the governed, and the idea that the entire purpose of the state is to protect our basic inherent rights to life, liberty, and property.
And finally, there's that core conflict we've returned to again and again.
The deep, fascinating tension between the universal power of his principles, natural liberty for all, and his own personal involvement in the exploitative systems of his day, from slavery to his proposals for child labor.
It forces us to ask if these grand ideals can ever really be separated from the messy economic compromises of the real world.
It's a remarkable legacy. It shows that even the most brilliant thinkers are products of their time, trapped in that gap between high ideals and economic reality.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you, our listener.
Locke's philosophy creates the intellectual framework for unlimited wealth accumulation through the use of money. But he also insists that government exists to moderate the conflict that this inequality will inevitably create.
So the system he helped design is now a global reality with vast entrenched inequality. The question for you to explore is this. If John Locke were alive today, looking at the world his ideas helped build, what specific pragmatic principles would he advise our governments to apply to solve this inequality without betraying his own core principle of the natural right to property?
What does moderating the conflict actually look like in the 21st century?
Something to ponder. Thanks for diving deep with us.